This program is a presentation of University of California Television. Your support makes UCTV's programming possible. Contribute online at uctv.tv/support. Check out our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, at youtube.com/UCTV Prime. Subscribe today to get new programs every week.
Thank you for coming this evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the panel on the American Presidency. My name is Ramu Nagappan. I am the Director of the Humanities and Education Department at UC Berkeley Extension, and we are co-presenters of this event with the Robert T. Matsui Center for Politics and Public Service in the Institute of Governmental Studies here at UC Berkeley. The event is also co-sponsored by the Berkeley Political Review, the Undergraduate Political Science Association, and Pi Sigma Alpha. So we're grateful for everyone who's helped pull this event together. As always, we're incredibly lucky to have a group of fantastic and lively panelists. I'm sure you're going to enjoy hearing from them shortly. We'll have no shortage of fireworks, perhaps, and topics to cover, given all the political developments of the last year, and of course, the upcoming presidential election. I'd like to say a few words now for our moderator tonight, Ethan Rarick. Ethan is the director of the Center on Politics and Publications at the Institute of Governmental Studies. As a journalist, he's written for many publications covering California and Oregon. He's the author of the book California Rising, The Life and Times of Pat Brown. He's also the editor of California Votes, the governor's race, which was published this year in 2012. So without further ado, Ethan Rarick.
Thank you, Ramu, and thank you to all of you for coming. You're the hardy band of political junkies who chose to forego the NCAA championship game tonight to be here instead. If anybody has divergent interests, I'll tell you at halftime, Kentucky is ahead 41-27. So if you're a Kansas fan, it's a bad night. As Ramu said, we have a terrific panel this year. So let me introduce them, and then we'll get to talking first about the Obama presidency, I think really more than just the past year, really the entire first term, and then talk some about the 2012 election as well. Starting at the far end of the line is Andrew Busch. Andrew is Crown Professor of Government and George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College in Southern California. He teaches courses on American politics and government. He's the author or co-author of many books, including Ronald Reagan and the Politics of Freedom and the Constitution on the Campaign Trail, the surprising political career of America's founding document. He's also one of the co-authors of Epic Journey, the 2008 Elections and American Politics. Andrew's also director of the Rose Institute at Claremont McKenna, the Rose Institute of State and Local Government, and chair of the government department there. Next to Andrew is Paul Pierson. Paul is the John Gross Professor of Political Science right here at Cal. His teaching and research fields include American politics and public policy. His most recent book is Winner-Take-All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class, which he co-authored with Jacob Hacker. He's also the author of another book that he co-authored with Jacob, Off-Center, The Republican Revolution and the Erosion of American Democracy. In 1995, he won the American Political Science Association's prize for the best book on American national politics with Dismantling the Welfare State, Reagan, Thatcher, and the Politics of Retrenchment. He previously was chair of the UC Berkeley Department of Political Science, and before that he taught at Harvard, the Berkeley of the East. Next to Paul is John Fund. John is the senior editor at the American Spectator and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, although currently he's on a book leave from the Journal. He previously wrote for the Journal's daily political diary section online. He's the author of several books, including Stealing Elections, How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy, and that's his book that's on sale, and The Dangers of Regulation Through Litigation. He's also a political analyst at Fox News. In 1993, he received the Warren Brooks Award for Journalistic Excellence from the American Legislative Exchange Council. And next to me is Ann Kornblut. She is the Deputy National Political Editor for The Washington Post. She was formerly the Post's White House correspondent and has covered presidential campaigns since the year 2000. She's the author of a widely acclaimed book, Notes from the Cracked Ceiling, about the Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin candidacies, and more broadly about women in national politics. Anne previously worked for the Washington bureaus of the New York Times and the Boston Globe, where she started covering national politics in 1998. In 2001, she won the Aldo Beckman Award for Distinguished White House Coverage. So we have a terrific panel. So I'm going to start, as I mentioned to the panelists, by asking each of them, since I think our first task is to sort of look at President Obama's first term and to try to get a sense of what his first term has meant, and then we'll move into the 2012 election. So I'd like each of you to give us a very short summary of how you see Obama's first term. Glorious success, horrible failure, radical departure, moderate incrementalist approach, whatever it is that you think summarizes Obama's first term. And why don't we just go down the line, and Andrew, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Ethan. I guess I would just start by saying that I think a fair way of appraising President Obama's term thus far is that at best, it's really a mixed bag. And I think there are obviously a lot of Americans who like the president a lot who don't like him a lot. And the ones in the middle, I think, are in the middle because there's a lot of, on the one hand, this, and on the other hand, that. So, for example, when it comes to the economy, on the one hand, the economy stabilized and has had some growth. On the other hand, the economic recovery has been fairly mediocre by historical standards, and unemployment remains quite high. When it came to legislation, the president, on the one hand, was very successful in his first couple of years in achieving a significant number of big legislative victories. On the other hand, a plurality or majority of Americans in many cases seem not to appreciate those legislative successes. So there was a very large stimulus package that passed. Most Americans say they don't think it did much good. There was a big health care bill that passed. In recent polls, I think last week during the discussions in the Supreme Court, somewhere around 2/3 of people who were asked said they thought it was unconstitutional. And significant pluralities or majorities continue to say that they think it ought to be repealed, at least in most polls. And then there was the Dodd-Frank bill, which was a very big, important bill on financial regulation. That, in the view of a lot of people, really overshot the mark. You could make a pretty decent argument that the financial crisis could possibly have been avoided with a few simple rules. You have to put 10% down on a house. You have to prove your income. And if you loan money, you have to keep the loan, or at least maybe half of the loan for 3 years or more. But the response of the Dodd-Frank bill was 2,700 pages of additional regulation. So that's a mixed bag, I think, at best. And this is reflected in the president's approval ratings. If you look at the Real Clear Politics average, kind of their daily average of presidential approval, from the end of November 2009, President Obama has had an approval rating in excess of 50% for 4 days in January of 2011, and then for a month after the killing of Osama bin Laden. And the entire rest of the time since the end of November 2009, he's been below 50%. Now, there are some individual polls where he's popped slightly above that, but if you look at the average, he's been below 50% for the vast majority of that time. So Americans clearly are conflicted, not terribly enthused on average. And I think the triumphalism that you saw in 2008 at this point would have to be said to have been somewhat misplaced. And I think that doesn't mean that he hasn't done some important things. And if he's reelected, and we'll get into that question more later, some of these policy changes may prove to be indeed transformative in certain very important ways. But at the moment, I think it's clear that things have not been as smooth a sailing as he thought they might be, and as a lot of his supporters thought they might be.
Lots of things to pick up there as we go on. But Paul, give us your...
Yes, I'm tempted to already start trying to rebut some points, but I think I'll just lay out a few observations to start how I think about Obama's first, now almost 4 years. And I guess the place that I would start is by saying that I think we have a tendency to focus too much on the president as an individual and expect that this heroic leader is going to be the source of either all solutions or all problems if we disagree with them. And in fact, the president plays a central role in American politics, but also a highly constrained role. And I think in a lot of ways, a more fruitful way to think about this is by looking at the experience of the Obama administration, what does it tell us about our politics more broadly? And I think the last few years have been highly revealing about the state of American politics and the way in which the administration has struggled with the constraints that it's faced, I think, tells us a lot about where we are, and a lot of what it tells us isn't, I think, particularly encouraging. Just two observations about the broad picture that Obama inherited. I think about this, I'm sometimes reminded, there's a New Yorker cartoon from the late 70s, a time when a lot of American cities were struggling, and the cartoon shows a couple's bedroom, and the man is sitting bolt upright, and he says, you know, I just had this horrible nightmare that I was elected mayor of a major American city, you know, and I think sometimes that Obama inherited a situation like that. Not a normal economic downturn, the worst economic crisis since the Depression. We were, I think, by many accounts, not just partisan ones, by many accounts, on the precipice of a depression. And there was that immediate economic crisis, but even behind that, there, I would say, has been a more slow-moving, long-term economic crisis for the American middle class over the last 30 years, right, where basically the income standards, so the standard of living, real incomes of most Americans stopped growing. Not entirely, but almost entirely stopped growing. To the extent that they were continuing to grow, they were only growing because people were working more hours, not because what they were being paid was going up. And that, following 30 years of very broad-based prosperity, represented a fundamental challenge, right? So there's both an immediate economic crisis and and I would say a deeper economic crisis facing the American system. So that's the first part of the story. The second part of the story is a political system that I think has been becoming over time increasingly dysfunctional. A political system in which the parties are increasingly polarized, and at the same time, a political system that is becoming like Sacramento's. Washington is becoming like Sacramento because you have, welcome to California, and you know, Washington is becoming, I think, increasingly like California, where the parties are increasingly separate from each other, but at the same time, you need supermajorities in order to get policy done, right? So you have essentially a parliamentary party system developing in a system where the minority can, in many cases, block the majority. And that is, I think, a very, very dysfunctional combination, right? And it's the combination that Obama's had to deal with for, you know, since he came into office. And so when I put those two stories together, the size of the challenges that the administration faced, and I've only began to scratch the surface of those challenges. We could talk about healthcare as another massive challenge facing the American political and social system. The size of the challenges and the increasing difficulty of getting anything done in Washington in this polarized plus supermajority context, that is what the administration has struggled with over the last few years. And my own view would be that, you know, I would give the Obama administration kind of a B grade, and I don't mean a grade inflation B grade, I mean a genuine B grade. I think given the size of the challenges that they've faced and the obstacles towards getting any effective governance out of the political system, I think they've done pretty well for reasons that hopefully I'll be able to outline a little later. I would give the American political system a D. I think we face, and have been facing over the last 20 or 30 years, enormous challenges of governance where you need effective policy making in Washington to respond to those challenges. And I think increasingly the system is proving not to be up to the task.
Well, I grew up a few miles from here, so it really is good to be back home. And actually, Paul and I agree on several key points. One is we give presidents too much credit for a lot of things, and the other is we give them too much blame for a lot of things. But it is certainly true that every president enters the office in challenging times. But in modern political times, the last 50 years, when the two-party system started to really coalesce around ideological camps, the only president who has ever had the kind of House majority and the 60-seat filibuster-proof majority that you need to pass key legislation has been Barack Obama for 2009 and part of 2010. And I disagree with Paul. I think he got a lot done. He got the stimulus plan that he wanted. Whether or not it was the plan he should have had is a separate issue. But as economists said, you pass this, unemployment will not go over 8%. How's that working out? He passed his health care plan. He got gays in the military changed. That had been a 20-year struggle. Bill Clinton failed at that. He got Dodd-Frank passed. A slew of regulations, including regulations that the Environmental Protection Agency has passed that American business is in full warfare over. And he's issued a whole slew of executive orders. He's been a very active, assertive president. He's accomplished a lot. But the quantity is not so much important this November as it will be the quality. And I want to focus on just one aspect of what he did. The health care plan, it was a close call, I think, as to whether Barack Obama was going to focus on the economy first or health care. In fact, there's a new book out in which there's a discussion between Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary. They're talking with Obama at the beginning of his administration. Mr. Obama began the conversation talking of the transformative domestic policies he had promised and now would pursue. Geithner and Summers cautioned the crisis Obama had inherited was so severe it would constrain him. Quote, "Your legacy is going to be preventing the second Great Depression," unquote, Mr. Geithner said. Vexed, Mr. Obama replied, "That is not enough for me." So he chose to pursue health care. Now, regardless of what you think about the health care bill, the perception set in, because it took a year and a half to pass it, that he had taken his eye off the jobs ball and off the economy ball and focused on health care. Now, I think Obama overlearned some lessons from the Clinton-Hillary care debacle. One of the lessons that I think he thought he learned was, no matter how unpopular it is, pass it anyway, people will learn to love it. How's that working out for us? The president made some comments today about the Supreme Court. He actually misspoke and said that he, I guess, presumed that they would overrule it, and then he corrected himself. The tectonic plates have shifted in Washington in terms of perception. Most people now expect the health care individual mandate is gone. Jeffrey Toobin says that. Jonathan Turley, many liberal legal scholars. The quiet betting is the whole law is going to go because it's so complicated and so integrally interconnected. And if that happens, I think it will be a great lost opportunity because we do have real health care problems. We do have a health care system that's broken. And the president will have pursued, I think, with reckless abandon, a health care bill that simply didn't make sense. You can't have your Solicitor General, regardless of how many times he coughs or drinks sips of water, you can't have him go into the Supreme Court of the United States on Tuesday and say this is a penalty, the individual mandate, and the next day he shows up and says it's a tax. The Supreme Court is not amused by that. You cannot have a law that is so sloppily written, no health care analyst thinks it makes sense. It would be an insult to Rube Goldberg. Now, they may agree with the conclusions, but how the parts interconnect is a mess. It's 2,700 pages. I'll give you just one example. Every standard piece of legislation in Washington has a severability clause in it. It says if the court strikes down any one part of this law, the rest of the law stands. Congress labored a year and a half over this law, and there was no severability clause. Now, regardless of what excuses they come up with, the simple truth is they forgot it. The court is not amused by that. And frankly, a lot of people aren't amused by that. If the president in late June, as I think will happen, will see his major domestic policy accomplishments swept away by the Supreme Court, you can say it was political, you can say that it was ideological, but the bottom line is the American people will say, you labored a year and a half for this, some of us think you took your ball off the economy, and where are we? And that explains in part why we are where Professor Busch said we are. The president's popularity numbers are not promising. You know, there are two numbers that people watch when they're looking for a president to be reelected. What percentage is his approval number, and what percentage of people think he deserves reelection. He's not over 50% in either category. He's at 46%. Times can change. The economy can get a whole lot better, though I don't think it will. The latest European unemployment numbers came out today. The Eurozone is at 11% unemployment. They're slipping into deep recession. Europe catches pneumonia. We're going to catch a little bit of a cold. I think that will slow down some of the economic progress we're going to have. And you can have a foreign policy success. You can have all kinds of things happen. Certainly the Republicans are nominating a weak candidate. You know, what is the Mitt Romney slogan from his supporters? I'm mild about Mitt. This is not a man who evinces great enthusiasm. But a presidential election is more than a contest between two candidates. It's a referendum on that president's record. And even poor candidates have been able to defeat incumbent presidents in the past based on the fact that they underperformed based on expectations. Now, it's unfair because Barack Obama could never have met all of the expectations that people had for him. His was an historic, path-breaking election, one all Americans can be proud of. But ultimately, a lot of Democrats and a lot of liberals recognize the truth of what Bill Clinton once said. Democrats tend to fall in love with a candidate, and that sometimes means taking a risk on a blind date. You shouldn't. Republicans tend to fall in line behind a candidate and just ask who's next in line. Mitt Romney's a perfect example of that. Last Thursday, there was a dinner party in Washington in which a leading strategist for the Hillary Clinton campaign of 2008 was there, and the conversation went around about how disastrous the Supreme Court arguments had been for the Obama administration. And one of the people sitting next to the strategist said, you know, what would you do in the 2008 campaign if you had to do it over again? You know, I remember that ad that you had someone in the White House, and you know, the phone rings at 3 a.m. Who would you want to have answer that? You know, the seasoned Hillary Clinton or the freshman senator from Illinois? And the strategist said, yeah, I like that ad. I like that ad. So the person sitting next to him said, well, if you did the ad over again, would you change anything? And he said, yes. I think I would make the 3 a.m. call come in at 3 p.m. The bottom line is, yes, Barack Obama was an historic candidate. Yes, he really did make a lot of people very enthusiastic and inspire a great many people. But ultimately, you're judged by results and by performance. And even though they don't say it all publicly, it is liberals and Democrats who are the most disappointed and the most disillusioned in many respects by the Obama administration. And while they will vote for Barack Obama, I suspect a lot of them are not going to make the phone calls, the emails, walk the precincts, or be quite as enthusiastic as in 2008 when he won that historic election.
I'll give Paul a moment to shoot back because I could see him looking in a bit. But go ahead, and then we'll come back.
You know,
so, Ann, go ahead.
It's interesting because I covered the Hillary Clinton campaign and then wrote a book about it in 2008. I'm often on the receiving end of very quiet questions from people who want to know, what do I think? Would she be doing a better job right now if she were president? Of course, I can't answer that. That's a hypothetical, but I agree with you. And I also would agree with both of you on the point that the president receives far too much credit and far too much blame, no matter who the president is. I have a friend who works for the Secret Service doing the threat assessments of all of the threatening phone calls that the president gets, and she's done this for many years. And she said that 90% of the people who call have no idea who the president is at any given moment. They just know that he's to blame for whatever their issue is.
And they write letters in crayon with red ink.
In capital letters, that's right. I think I would say that the first term, maybe the only term, but the first 3 years of President Obama have, for him, been a learning curve. I think that whatever disappointments people had, his supporters might have had, whatever shock and horror his critics have found in watching him, it is matched by how President Obama and the people around him have been surprised by what they've encountered. You could call that naive. You could call that being disappointed by the system itself. But I think it took them about 2.5 years to discover what everyone else already knew, which was that it was a partisan city that required extraordinary political skills to get anywhere. And strangely, this president, having achieved the highest political station in the country, doesn't really like politics. He doesn't really like doing politics or the art of politics. And he doesn't really like being around people all that much, other than the ones that he knows. And he doesn't like to negotiate. He likes to think about politics, and he likes to think, some say that's professorial, but he really does not like to schmooze or to negotiate or any other things that have typically gone with politics. Unlike Bill Clinton, who obviously adored it, and unlike Bush, the most recent Bush, who was born to it to a certain extent and liked it perhaps a little bit better. So I think that they have discovered only recently that it's going to require, if they get a second term, even more partisanship on their part, they believe. There was a big turning point around the debt ceiling talks, which we haven't mentioned here, but I think we could talk about this past summer, where President Obama, by all accounts, just decided he'd had it with Congress, that he had been asking nicely for all these years for everyone to try to reach a compromise on a variety of issues, and he finally decided to give up. And I think you've noticed since then a change in his tone that is going to obviously carry on through the election. So whether that's an awakening for them that's too late, whether that's an awakening that the American people are going to recoil from, whether it's going to only turn off his critics more to see him become more partisan as he's out on the campaign trail, I don't know. But I do know that their mindset has changed, and not just because it's a whole new cast of characters around him now, although it is, with only a couple of exceptions. He's got a new team than when he first got there. But for them personally, they feel as though they're in a different place.
As I told the panelists beforehand, I want you all to jump in whenever you want, at least from here on out. So feel free, if you want to respond to what anybody just said, to jump in. But let me make one observation and kind of throw that to you, which is that I wondered, Andrew started by saying it's a mixed bag, the view is a mixed bag. But then we got quite different perceptions of the Obama presidency, naturally. I wonder, is it a mixed bag? Do people have a mixed perception, or is it that, given the nature of American politics and the polarization of American politics, that you get radically different perceptions from different groups of people? It's less that there are many people with a mixed view, and that the net whole may be mixed because you have half the people with one view, half the people with another view. And does that go to the polarization and the gridlock that makes, in part, it's difficult to get things done that Paul mentioned? Paul, do you want to?
I think that's absolutely right. So this characterization that the health care bill is wildly unpopular, I think it's just not accurate. Right? The country is very divided about the health care bill. And if you ask them about specifics, they're divided about the specifics. Some of them they really like. Most people don't like the mandate. They don't like to be told that they have to do it, and most people have a hard time getting their head around the idea that maybe all these pieces actually have to go together, that you have to have the things that you like as well as the things that you don't like. But overall, the country is divided about that, and as you say, it's not surprising. Polls on this and many other issues break down by partisanship, and independents are divided. And it's the same thing if you were looking at Obama's approval ratings, highly polarized.
And that is worse now than in the past, correct?
Yeah, if you looked at presidencies, over a period of time, you would find that the gap between the approval ratings of partisans has grown steadily over time, going back to the 60s or 70s. It used to be, there's always been a gap. People tend to favor presidents who are from their party, but the gap used to be much, much smaller than it was, not just under Obama, but under Bush and under Clinton.
Look, I'll agree with Paul that there are parts of the health care bill that people like. 56% like the fact that if you can be 26 years old, you can still be on your parents' health care plan. That's a majority. But if you take the Pew poll, which is 52% of Democrats support the bill, Gallup, 56%, this is among Democrats. Now, many of them wanted single payer, many of them wanted public option, so there may be dispute from the left that the plan didn't go far enough. But the bottom line is, if you have 52 to 56% of your party's partisans in favor of your signature domestic policy
ask them
achievement.
what percentage would want to repeal the bill? What percentage of Democrats want to repeal the bill? Tiny.
If you have 52 or 56% of your party in favor of what you did.
They would prefer something else.
And if you have close, over a third of your Democrats who think that the individual mandate is unconstitutional, that is called a political. Yes, it is. I can give you the citations. It's over 65% think it's unconstitutional. Break it down by party, it's over a third of Democrats.
Do you think the bill's unconstitutional?
We're about to find out.
No, we're about to find out what 5 Republican members of the Supreme Court think. It's not the same thing.
Legal scholars say when the Solicitor General was not able to articulate any limiting principle as to what kind of mandate they would say wouldn't pass muster, that's failing oral argument 101.
Charles Freed, Solicitor General under Reagan, says this bill is clearly constitutional and this is all politics. You know, read the interview with Ezra Klein. It is stunning. This is Reagan's Solicitor General. Says he is shocked by the questions that Republican appointees were asking.
He also said that if the individual mandate is declared unconstitutional, he will eat the hat that's in his closet. You'll be seeing him chewing on his hat.
I'm just saying, is it Reagan's Solicitor General saying this?
Do you believe that there is any limiting principle with a federal mandate that cannot pass constitutional muster if the health care bill is constitutional? In other words, the question the Solicitor General was asked by justices of both sides, the liberals and the conservatives.
So I'm not
a
a constitutional law scholar, but to me, that's not the question.
Well, I'm not one either, and you asked me if it was constitutional, so I'm asking you.
So my answer to the question, is it constitutional? I would say under precedent, right? Under precedent, it's clearly constitutional. Right.
So there's no limiting principle.
As fun as this is, let Andrew.
I don't think there is a precedent, because I don't think there's any precedent of the federal government requiring people to engage in commerce and then regulating it as interstate commerce.
They're
I don't think
already
there's
engaged in commerce. Everybody is
by not doing anything.
Market.
Then nothing falls outside of the realm of commerce.
Well,
right?
healthcare is like what, 18% of the American economy, 18% of GDP. We're all in that market.
Does this, I don't want to redo the oral arguments before the court too much, although this is enjoyable to watch. But Paul, let me ask you, does this actually, you start off by saying he had done some things given the constraints of the system, but had not done, but here we are discussing, I mean, to take John's point from his opening comments, this is a major achievement. It may be good, it may be bad, but it's a major policy advance that the administration enacted, correct? So, I mean, does the president at least get points for having done a big thing here?
So I would say yes, and I would say in 2 respects, all right? So one is, so John was saying before, gee, you know, you shouldn't have done anything about health care, you take your eye off the ball. They just use it.
I did not say that.
Sorry. Okay. You're right. I was too concise. You're saying he made a mistake to go in whole hog for trying to produce healthcare reform when the economy was the big issue, right? Okay, so their view, which I actually think is correct, was that the long-term fiscal problems facing state and national government and the private sector as well are going to be impossible for us to address if we don't find a way to get healthcare costs under control, all right? I mean, we spend way more than any other country does, even though we have terrible coverage and even though our health performance statistics are not very good. So I think the administration felt like that was a challenge they had to take on, and they put together the best bill they could under the circumstances where they were going to get no help from Republicans, and they needed 60 votes to pass a bill. Okay, so. But just to come back quickly to the role of the Supreme Court on this, what is disturbing to me about it is, I think this is a very clear illustration of why the principle of precedent is a pretty important one. You have a democratically elected government that spends, as you say, a year and a half, partly because they were trying to see if they could work out some kind of a compromise, and so the thing got delayed and delayed and pushed on and pushed on. They spent a year and a half a crucial time working on this extraordinarily difficult problem, and at the time, nobody was saying that it was unconstitutional. These were ideas that were developed by the Heritage Foundation. They've been supported for years in different forms by leading Republican politicians. Nobody was saying it was unconstitutional because it was clearly inside previous Supreme Court rulings about the Commerce Clause.
First of all, whatever conservatives supported the individual mandate supported on policy grounds. They did not make an argument on constitutional grounds.
Because everybody thought it was constitutional.
The constitutional argument is separate from whether or not it's a good idea. As for precedent, let me remind you, Roe v. Wade swept aside 180 years of precedent. In 1986, Bowers v. Hardwick, John Kennedy's appointee to the Supreme Court, Byron White, wrote the decision saying consensual acts between gays can be illegal in any state in the country. 16 years later in the Lawrence decision, Justice Kennedy, the Reagan appointee, said, no, we're going to overturn that precedent and we're going to have no apologies about overturning that precedent. There are precedents the Supreme Court has overridden that everyone in this room would agree with. They're doing so. So let's not say precedent is a straitjacket forever binding us.
I'm not saying it's a straitjacket.
It is a guideline, but times change, perspectives change, and the breadth of this argument, the individual mandate. The federal government traditionally, not the states and the localities, the federal government traditionally has said you have to serve in a jury, you have to pay an income tax, and you have to serve the military in time of war. Those are the things the federal government normally requires you to do. To have them individually require you to buy a consumer product from a greedy insurance company, whether you like it or not, and whether or not it fits what you want, it goes far beyond catastrophic health care coverage, is unprecedented, and it calls into question any previous precedent, and most legal scholars will agree it was unprecedented.
That's not true.
Okay, well I'm going to drag you guys back from the oral arguments another time, because otherwise somebody from the law school is going to come over and shoot us for taking their territory. So
malpractice.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I do want to go back to a point that was made that whether should the administration have tackled health care in the midst of this economic crisis. I understand Paul's argument that on policy grounds that was a good idea, but was there a political perception problem? And maybe you can talk about this. Was there a perception that he should have focused on the economy and not done healthcare?
Well, look, let's go back to the original decision to focus on healthcare. This is not something that he particularly ran on. I mean, yes, it was part of the...
In fact, he opposed the individual mandate.
He opposed the individual mandate. He talked about it. Certainly it was part of the, Democratic platform for both he and Hillary Clinton, but it wasn't something he said he vowed he was going to do on day one. In fact, the economy was something that by the end of 2008, certainly in October, was what he'd said he would focus on, and is a large part of the reason that he beat McCain. I mean, those final, if you remember, in 2008, as the economy was tanking and McCain briefly suspended his campaign, and then he had picked Palin, and he seemed not to do what he was doing. Obama looked very presidential, almost for the first time in that campaign. It was about the economy. So his decision to then turn to healthcare is still baffling even to some people in the administration. But he wanted to do something big. He did want to do something that his Democratic predecessor, Bill Clinton, had not been able to do. Some people think out of sheer competitiveness, others think because he has a quest to be very historic, and others because he cares about it, even though his claim that his own mother was battling insurance companies up into her death, which is partly true. It was not over reimbursements, it was over her unemployment insurance. But he talks often on the campaign trail about his own mother's experience, and obviously that's something that haunted him. But he had a lot of advisors around him who said, yes, okay, this is fine. There were big fights in the very beginning. So it's true that there are people now in the administration, or people who've left the administration, who look back, regret having done it, and not just because of the economy, because there is the question of what else, okay, so if he hadn't done healthcare, what was he going to spend his time actually doing on the economy? The number of times that he's pivoted back to the economy, that word, we've tried to ban it from our stories because he's turned back to the economy so many times, other than another stimulus, simply going out and talking about the economy more and more and more. He had time to do both things at the same time. But there were other things that have failed. I mean, and things that, frankly, his base have been very dissatisfied with. The thing he vowed he would do on day one, and did do on day one, was sign an executive order to close Guantanamo. And That didn't work out. And in part, it was because he didn't have the political capital in his first year. He was spending the political capital on health care. And he couldn't get Democrats to go along. He was asking Democrats to do too many other things. And in the end, they decided, forget it, we can't get this done. And so to this day, they've given up. I think that's probably, if you had to look at things that are definitive failures for him and that he would say were failures, that's one. He signed an executive order. It didn't happen. They failed. So I think that actually falls in the category of the mixed bag. On the flip side of that, they did get Osama bin Laden. That's something that George W. Bush spent all the years of his presidency promising he was going to do, dead or alive, and he didn't do it, and he left office. And, Obama did it. And whether, I know there are some who have said since then, oh, well, I can't remember who said it recently. I think maybe it was Dick Cheney. There was a Republican who said, well, of course, anybody would have done it that way. Well, he did it. He got to do it as president, so he gets that. Again, in the mixed bag category. But on the question of healthcare, I think that's why we're seeing now so many of the books that are being written about this president being written about the economic team and being written about the domestic policy, which isn't, it didn't seem riveting necessarily at the time, but in hindsight, there were a lot of fights about it.
Could he have, you mentioned things that he did that did not please his base. Would it have been possible for this president to have pleased his base? Weren't expectations raised so high by his election that it would have been impossible for him to please many of his own supporters?
Well, as I was thinking about that on the drive over here, noticing, I suspect there's some members of his base in this community, and
just a few.
Seeing all the 2008 stickers, and you don't see as many 2012 stickers anywhere, Berkeley or elsewhere, as you do. And I think there is no way. I mean, it's true he could have said or tried to do all the things he said he was going to do to please the base, and perhaps then faced impeachment from the Congress, and maybe even lost worse in the midterms in 2010. But there's no way, because so many of the promises were vague. I mean, hope and change were vague for a reason. And hope is something that's not really a word that he even uses as much. Change he still talks about. And you've noticed recently he started saying this is what change looks like. When he talks, he's defending the healthcare plan very robustly now, and singling out the most popular provisions. He doesn't just talk about healthcare for everyone. He talks about 26-year-olds still being on their parents' insurance and pre-existing conditions still being wiped away for people. So they've done their research. They know what people like. But otherwise, hope and change meant, I think, what people wanted to hear. And I think it's clear, even listening here tonight, he remains the Rorschach test in some ways that he was in 08.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to get on this? Was he
well, yeah, I would,
by his own expectations?
I would say a couple of things. The first one is that I think that's absolutely true, that it was not possible for him to meet the expectations that were out there. And I think you see this with a lot of presidents who come in with a very devoted base. So if you sort of go back to the Reagan years, there were actually a lot of conservatives who were complaining about Reagan and saying, well, he's not doing this, he's not doing that, he's negotiating with the Soviets, what is he thinking? And so there's a certain quality like that I think is inevitable anytime someone comes into office whose supporters think they're going to be a kind of transformative president. Having said that, I do think that President Obama probably made his own problem worse than it had to be by the nature of the campaign that he ran in 2008, which in a certain respect deliberately inflated expectations, I think, or at least, if not deliberately inflated them, then left people free to imagine whatever they wanted to about what he was capable of. And so I think that's, to a certain degree, of his own making, but I think a large part of it was inevitable.
Paul? Well, let Paul go and then.
Look, the single biggest source of disappointment with the Obama administration is the fact that the unemployment rate is still about 8.5%. Right, and the true unemployment numbers out there, or the true level of economic difficulty out there, which in some ways, it's, a lot of people aren't in those numbers because they've dropped out of the labor force entirely. Right? If you look at what, in some ways, I think is actually more telling about the state of the economy, which is the percentage of people who are of working age who are employed, the numbers are still really bad.
It's the lowest in over
right.
20 years.
Now, longer than that, I think. I mean, they're really bad. And to me, in a lot of ways, the surprising thing is not that Obama's approval ratings are as low as they are; it's that they're as high as they are. given the state of the economy. And I think most people, if you had asked a year or two ago, if Obama's approaching, the re-election season and the unemployment rate is still well above 8%, what are his chances of being re-elected? I think people would have thought they're pretty low. They're pretty low. Mm-hmm. I actually think his chances of being re-elected are pretty good, better than 50-50. Now, some of that has to do with the Republican Party, which we haven't talked about yet, and I hope that we will. Yeah. But some of it has to do with the fact that I think there's still a fair amount of recognition out there that this was a big economic wave that hit the country. And if you ask people in polls, who do you hold, even today, who do you hold most responsible for the state of the economy? The policies of the Obama administration or the policies of the Bush administration? You still get more people saying the Bush administration policies. Now, they're probably not going to be thinking that all that much when they go into the voting booth.
He's not on the ballot.
He's not on the ballot. But I do think it says, again, it says something about putting in context the kind of challenges that the administration has faced. And just one last thing. Did they take their eye out the ball of the economy? Look, there are three big pieces of legislation. There's actually quite a lot of other stuff that one could talk about. But three big pieces of legislation passed by this administration. Right? One is the financial reform, one is the stimulus package, and one is the health care bill. Right? So 2 out of the 3 were on the economy. And the third is actually really about the long-term performance of the economy. At least that's how they would view it.
Okay. The biggest enemy of job creation is uncertainty. Businessmen and businesswomen will tell you over and over again, it's not so much what the rules of the game are, it's whether or not there's predictability, consistency, and constancy. And, unless they're making it up, surveys of business people, not just Fortune 500, but NFIB members and a whole bunch of people say, regardless of what Obama passed, it increased uncertainty. Small employers are now actively debating whether or not to drop people from the health coverage because the fine, frankly, isn't big enough. It's $2,000. If you're a small employer, you can really make out like a bandit if you drop someone's health coverage if they're an employee. The environmental regulations, not saying good or bad, I'm simply saying lots of uncertainty there, and lots of new uncertainty. All kinds of things regulated that weren't before. The stimulus package, all kinds of problems getting that money through the pipeline. Government procurement. I mean, the president, to his chagrin, and I have some sympathy for this, there are no shovel-ready jobs, his famous statement. He was wrong. Economic uncertainty, leaving aside whether it was a good bill or a bad bill, increased under this administration the first 2 years. That retarded economic job creation. How do we know this? Apple is sitting on $120 billion. Companies all over this country are sitting on cash. They're not investing it. The best guess is there's $2.2 trillion of capital sitting on the sidelines. It's not because people don't want to deploy it. It's not selfish. They're not putting it under the mattress for selfish reasons. It's because there's too much uncertainty. And Obama is a part of that, and the Democratic Congress is a part of that. And yes, the Republican obstructionists are a part of that, too.
Isn't part of the problem on, Paul, do you want to quickly? Okay.
I feel like I'm getting my share.
Okay. Isn't part of the problem on the economy for the president that his best argument is it would have been worse had I not done what I did, had the stimulus been smaller or not enacted, had Dodd-Frank not passed, it would have been worse. And that's hard to see and hard to prove. So part of the difficulty here is that his argument is kind of a negative, right? It's in a vacuum. And isn't that, Andrew, you're shaking your head, you're nodding your head.
I agree, absolutely. I think that's always a hard argument to make. Even, there may be some truth to it, there may not be, but it's difficult to demonstrate, and it's difficult for people to latch onto that. And in a certain respect, I would compare it, I guess to be a little bit provocative, to George Bush's argument after the Iraq War, which was, well, if we hadn't done this, Saddam Hussein would have done something worse. That may well have actually been true, but there was no way to prove it, and it was not an argument that was sustainable. And I think the president has a similar problem with the economy, just in terms of the argument that he has to make.
I suppose we should talk a little bit about foreign policy before we go to the election. So let's do that quickly, and then we'll start talking about the election. Let me also suggest that members of the audience might want to write out their question cards and hand them down to the end of the aisle, and some people will be circulating around to collect those cards, and then eventually they'll be brought up to me. So if you have questions, go ahead and write them out. Trust me, we're going to get to the 2012 election, so don't just write a question that says, what about the 2012 election? Quickly on foreign policy, is there more of a consensus on foreign policy among the panel? If I were to say the president said he was going to withdraw troops from Iraq, he did that. He was going to implement a surge in Afghanistan, he did that. He got Osama bin Laden. At a very simple level, it sounds like he achieved his principal foreign policy goals in that regard. Those are the ones he ran on. Fewer troops in Iraq, more troops in Afghanistan. Does he generally get credit for a successful foreign policy that doesn't get noticed because of the bad economy?
It's the strongest part of his approval ratings. Look, I think, Iraq was a mess. I think he handled it probably as best you can be. Let's cross our fingers and hope sectarian strife doesn't break out. If I had any fault to give, it is that there are regions of the world where the president, frankly, hasn't spent enough time or energy, or his appointees have in South America, being very critical. We have all kinds of problems in South America, all kinds of unfriendly governments, all kinds of demagogues down there. Surprisingly, I don't think he's spent as much time on promoting internal democratic reform in Africa that you'd think a president who has that kind of moral standing. I mean, I have friends who live in Kenya. When he showed up in Kenya as a senator, I mean, it was an incredibly electric moment. And I think that he had a real opportunity there to promote democratic reform and to fight corruption in Africa using the IMF and the World Bank as proxies.
But you're much less critical of him on foreign policy matters than you are on domestic matters.
Look, Iraq
correct?
and Afghanistan would have been a horrible thicket for any president. Sure. Now, Afghanistan is not going well. On the other hand, it's never really been going well. No occupying army in Afghanistan has ever done well.
More or less everybody sort of agree? I mean, there's nobody who's attacking him on foreign policy issues.
Interestingly, I mean, well, and if you look at what foreign policy is, right, it's the one area where he can act more or less unilaterally. And so where he hasn't had to negotiate with Congress or really anybody else, he's been able to, consulting generals, but where he can act on his own, he's tended to do better. And interestingly, by all accounts of the White House, this is the area of study that he has warmed to the most. Now, all presidents tend to, but because it is the most interesting and they learn a lot more than they knew beforehand, and that's certainly true in his case. But the people who brief him on foreign policy say that he has studied more and learned more and loves it more than the people who brief him on domestic politics and policy, where he seems to be nothing but frustrated almost all the time, which was the point I was going to add earlier, which is about living up to expectations. I mean, one of the great promises of his campaign in 2008 was we were going to get past all this partisan stuff. And the fact that not only have we not, but it's gotten worse. I mean, if you go back and read The Audacity of Hope in the beginning of his book, he talks about, the 60s and that whole Clinton legacy and all that, party stuff, and we're ready to get past that this generation. And obviously, that wasn't true. And I think for people, even beyond the economy in some ways, which obviously is something concrete people feel, but for people who really loved him in 2008 and who now kind of shrug, a lot of it is that it's still going on.
Which to some degree was his own, I don't know if I can say excessive promises, but a sense of promise that was unfulfillable.
Well,
correct?
and you could blame him.
You were not going to remove partisanship from the American political system.
Nobody who lives in Washington thought that. I mean, we certainly didn't. And Republicans would blame him for having exacerbated it by the way he behaved when he got there and some of what he's attempted. But the people in the White House would say that they are victims of it, and they had no idea how bad it was until they got there.
So talking about partisan politics, let's switch, and there's certainly a lot more we could discuss about the first term, but let's talk a little bit about the 2012 election, since the president is running again, obviously. Does everybody agree, first of all, just to get out of the way, barring something completely unforeseen, Mitt Romney is the nominee, correct? And what does that tell us about the Republican Party, either that he is the nominee or that he has had such trouble securing the nomination?
Well, I have said earlier that the Republican Party tends to go to the next person in line. to show you how bad that situation has been over the decades, there's probably no one in this room who was, he had to be 21 years of age, by the way. There's probably no one in this room who voted in the 1948 presidential election. Or if there are, raise your hands.
If so,
okay, there's a couple. There's a couple. Okay, well, that's a long time ago. That's my only point. It's a long time ago. Between 1948 and 2008, all of the elections in between there, which is 60 years, a span of 3 generations, in every one of those presidential elections, save one, the Republican Party nominated for either president or vice president a Nixon, a Bush, or a Dole. The only exception being Goldwater Miller, 1964. That is too much time in the same end of the gene pool. And the Democratic Party has the opposite problem. They do blind dates. George McGovern, Jimmy Carter, these are blind dates. You don't know a lot about them. They didn't have a lot of experience in the national stage. The Republican Party tends to go very safe, very boring, and Mitt Romney was the next person in line, just like John McCain was the next person in line after Bush retired. And I think it is going to hurt them because there will be an excitement deficit and there'll be a gaffe component. But I think that increases the chances that Mitt Romney picks Marco Rubio for vice president. I would say that's pretty much a lock, barring last-minute Washington Post investigative pieces.
And you have something you want to tell?
No. Everybody's doing their job they're supposed to do. We deserve to know more. And that will be very interesting because I think that will tend to fire up the base. I think Rubio will not be easily Palin-ized. And the Hispanic vote, look, I think Hispanics are far too intelligent to simply vote for someone because of some heritage. Hispanics come from all over the place. Puerto Rican is not necessarily going to vote for a Cuban automatically, but it will bring the issue of the Hispanic vote in America front and center. There will be some ethnic pride component, and there will be a real debate about immigration and various other things. And I see Marco Rubio is already trying to broker a compromise on the DREAM Act to sort of soften some of the rough edges that developed in the partisan debate in Congress.
Do you think Romney is the strongest candidate the Republicans could have chosen?
I don't think anyone outside of Ann Romney thinks that.
Do you guys agree that he's not?
Well, the people who are running. So yeah. To me, to come back to your original question, is he just sort of the last man standing? The thing that is most striking to me watching the Republicans this year is that aside from Romney, the cast of characters who were brought up as serious contenders for the nomination was, I thought, a pretty shockingly motley crew, to be honest. Really, the fact that at the end of the day, the number 2 person in this race is Rick Santorum, who, when he ran for re-election in a moderate state, lost by 18 points, right? Suggests to me, and you could run through the whole list, Herman Cain and Rick Perry and Michelle Bachmann and Newt Gingrich. I think none of those people were going to be close to as compelling as presidential candidates in a general election as Romney will be. Right? So the fact that now you could say there's some mystery candidate out there who we wish would have run, but these are the people who actually were in a situation where they felt like it was in their interest to run, and they did. And Romney, I think, looks like the heavyweight champ. Compared with any of these other people.
One of the mystery candidates who was supposed to save the day did run, Rick Perry, and it turned out he was flamed out almost immediately.
And now we know he was on painkillers most of the time he was in the debates. Look, I'd be interested in what Andy has to say about this, but the partisanship and the polarization and the meat grinder nature of presidential politics has changed things a lot. John Thune, who was one of those candidates who might have run for president, senator from South Dakota in the Senate Republican leadership, I asked him, why didn't you run? And he said, my wife read Game Change, which was the story of the 2008 race behind the scenes, especially how it impacted the families. And apparently a lot of people read Game Change. Bobby Jindal's wife read Game Change. John Thune's wife read Game Change. Several people. Haley Barbour's entire family read Game Change. Mitch Daniels' wife, who has, shall we say, a rather interesting marital history that would have obviously been a subject of discussion, certainly read Game Change. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason they chose not to run, but I think there is now a game change factor in deciding to run for president, because how it impacts your family, not just the spouse, but the children, and just the circle of friends around you. It deters some people.
See, I disagree. I mean, sure, people don't want their lives looked into, but I think the egos that usually trumpet in presidential politics still exist.
Yeah, but the lesser and bigger egos. John Thune apparently didn't have as big a one.
That may be true, but I think a lot of them at the moment when they had to make the decision simply looked at Obama's numbers and said, this is not necessarily going to be my year. I mean, his numbers, even though they haven't been great, and obviously the unemployment rate has hovered too high for his re-election to be a lock, I think looked at this and said, why don't I just wait 4 more years? All of these people are young. And I actually disagree a little bit about Rubio. I think that if Romney does it, it will be because he's been talked into it. I think at this point, he is still looking at safety as his #1 goal and not picking anybody. I think they learned the lesson of, they too read Game Change, and I think the way that Sarah Palin was picked and the fact that he felt the need to pick someone dynamic, so everything we've seen so far indicates they want nothing dynamic, they just want somebody who will do no harm. So I think Rubio will be
Rob Portman called your office.
Right, exactly. Tim Pawlenty is back in the game. So yeah.
Andy, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, well, there were a couple of questions there. Why is, what does it say about the Republicans that Romney has had such a hard time? I think a couple of things. I think that there's a sense among a lot of Republicans that this is really going to be a very decisive election, that it's maybe more important than the average election in a lot of ways. And I think that they were hoping to find a candidate who kind of felt that in his bones in some way that Romney doesn't seem to entirely. I'm not sure what Romney feels in his bones entirely, if anything.
I have a PowerPoint I want to show you.
Yeah, and so I think they were waiting for that. They were looking for that, and it, unfortunately for them, none of the alternative candidates who had the other things that you would want, and so they kept bouncing from candidate to candidate. The other thing that I think is actually a factor that hasn't been discussed is the change in campaign finance. The fact that there are now the means for candidates to continue running after they would have probably dropped out a few years ago, and it's extended the race, and so that I think you have to take into account as well.
So just on that, I mean, that works both ways, right? Because you could also argue that Romney had an enormous financial advantage, mostly because of forms of campaign finance that were not in play 10 or 12 years ago, right? I mean, the super PAC money, which was, yes, it kept Gingrich alive, but it also allowed Romney to basically bury. Whenever he really needed a win, he could bury.
I'll spend them 5-1 or something, right? No, that's right. It works in both directions. But why has Romney won? Well, I think because Republicans think this is a decisive election and they want to win. And I think they've looked at their options and they've said, well, Romney is not that strong. He's got a lot of weaknesses, but in this field, he seems to be the most likely of anyone to be able to take it, to take on the president. And in fact, just a few days ago, there was a Rasmussen poll that showed the two of them at 46-46. So I don't think you can count Romney out in a general election. I think Romney is in a position that actually reminds me a lot of Bill Clinton in 1992, which is to say, if you looked at Bill Clinton in 1992, nobody thought he was the top-tier candidate. There were a whole bunch of Democrats, top-tier Democrats, Bill Bradley, Al Gore, Mario Cuomo, Dick Gephardt, who were going to run, and they saw George H.W. Busch at much higher approval rating than President Obama's had, and they said, no way, I'll take our turn later. So Clinton was strong within the field, but it wasn't that strong a field. He was kind of the top of the second tier. And in fact, in the same way that Romney has faced problems, Clinton would get to a point where he'd win and it seemed like he was on a roll, and just when everything, everyone thought he kind of had it wrapped up, Jerry Brown would come along and win Connecticut or Colorado or something like that, just because Democrats weren't sure about Clinton. They weren't quite ready to throw in with him yet. And so that was how it expressed itself. I mean, he wound up winning. People kind of knew at a certain point he was probably going to win, but Democrats wanted, they had concerns, and so these other candidates kept winning sometimes. So I think Romney's in a lot of ways in an analogous situation.
Andy's right. We now view Bill Clinton as this towering, masterful politician, but he had very low positive numbers in '92. He was running third in some polls, then Ross Perot dropped in, and Ross Perot dropped out, then Ross Perot dropped in again. And in the end, Ross Perot won 19% of the vote, Clinton won 43. Ross Perot winning 19% of the vote, of course, happened before people realized that Ross Perot's tray table was not in its full upright and locked position.
Although they should have realized that by that point, right, after he dropped out.
The last 60 Minutes interview was what is known in politics as a clue.
Yeah. One other thing to talk about briefly on why the Republican race has lasted this long, I don't think anybody mentioned, are the Republican rules this time around, which required proportional delegate awarding in all of the primaries except the first 4 up until now. Now you can do winner take all. That also extended the race. Everybody agreed. Do you want to talk about the changes in the Republican rules?
Sure. Well, I mean, everybody looked at 4 years ago on the Democratic side and said, isn't that fun? And they are all able to build party apparatuses in all of these important swing states as they go. I think the difference is, I mean, so the people who changed the rules, obviously, I think got a little more than they bargained for this time. But I think the difference is that it's not clear that Romney has been able to build a great organization. He's a very strong campaign and a very smooth headquarters, but that he hasn't been able to translate all these many races into the kind of field operation that Obama did in 2008, or that the party has emerged stronger than it was at the beginning. I think by some measure, Romney, the more people look at Romney, the less they like him, and that's probably the most disturbing polling figure he's had to have seen.
I looked at some polling numbers for Obama versus past presidents at this same March of the election year, and his Gallup approval number, for instance, less popular by a few points than Clinton, than George W. Bush, than Ronald Reagan, more popular than H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter. Everybody agreed that he would be the least popular president to win re-election or the most popular president to be defeated after one term of recent presidents. Is that a fair summary?
Based on approval ratings, and yeah, I think that's right.
And does the election basically boil down to the perception of the economy and people's perception of the economy? Is it, if it gets sufficiently better, whatever sufficient is, between now and November or now and the summer, he has a pretty good chance of winning, and if not, is that, or are there other factors? Will health care make a difference, for instance? Will the Supreme Court ruling make a difference?
Well, James Carville may say that the Supreme Court throwing out health care will be great for Democrats. Notice he didn't say great for Obama. Very careful distinction he made. Anyone who believes that having your signature domestic policy achievement thrown out by a court, even if you want to go or run against the court, is a politicized bunch of yahoos. Anyone who thinks that's good for your reputation, and basically, what do you have to show for yourself? I mean, regardless of whether or not there's a reason or an excuse that you lost health care, the bottom line is you lost it, and that would be very damaging.
Although the argument is not that it would help the reputation, but that it would energize the base, correct?
Yeah, and given the numbers of how popular this is with Democrats, some think it didn't go far enough. Some things people are scared of it. It's just not that big a motivator with the base. It really isn't. It's not the kind of galvanizing motivator that anti-Iraq policy was for the Democrats 5 years ago. Yes, there will be a lot of people upset if the Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional, but I don't think people are going to go to the barricades.
I agree with that. I mean, there's a ton, for what it's worth, there's a ton of political science research on this question, and most of which suggests the economy is by far the most important thing that you want to look at. I think in some cases it's exaggerated, the extent to which the economy matters. But if you asked me, what would I want to know about the next few months if I wanted to get a better bet on who is going to win, I would want to know how the economy is going to do over the next few months. I think that would tell you more than who Romney chooses as his running mate, or likely any single gaffe or something like that. But I think where we are, based on looking at the approval numbers and looking at where the economy numbers are, is like, as you suggested with the initial framing and looking at other presidents, we're in a very competitive situation. We're in a situation where Obama's numbers are not so bad that you would say he's going down, but they're not so good that you would say he's in great shape. So that when that's the case, just like in Florida in 2000, a lot of things mattered because it was close, right? Things that normally wouldn't matter like the way that the ballot was constructed, mattered because it was close, right? So I think at this point we're looking at an election where it's likely to matter. And one thing at this point that I think is starting to look like it may matter is what Ann was saying. The numbers on Romney right now, you know, his negatives are higher than any leading presidential candidate in the last since 1984, except for Hillary Clinton, who had similar negatives. Right? So, you know, that's not good.
Do you think it'll be as close as 2000?
I hope not.
It's
Gee,
very,
I hope so.
very
That was fun.
That was so
Although I'll get a
close.
book out of it.
Yeah.
That was so close. It's very unlikely to be that close.
Okay,
Yeah,
but
I would agree. It's very unlikely. That happens once every couple hundred years.
You know,
we've had our shots.
One of the things we should worry about, and this is bipartisan, Walter Dean Burnham, the Dean of American Political Scientists, says we have the sloppiest election system of any industrialized democracy. And this is not so much to do with fraud as it has to do with decentralization and competence, different standards. We just had, for example, in Florida, we had an optical scan machine breakdown, and 2 people that were declared the winner of, you know, the mayor and city council races last week were suddenly thrown out of office this week, and new people have been installed. I tell you, I hope it's not close, because I do not want to go through Florida 2000 again. And that's not just for partisan reasons. That is just because I think our democracy would be very fragile to go through a second one of those.
Andy, do you want to comment on does it boil down to the economy between now and November?
You know, I think I agree with Paul on this. That's going to be a crucial factor, but I don't think the economic situation is likely to be so good or so bad that it's going to decide the outcome in advance. I mean, I think elections are always some combination of fate and contingency. Right? You have the economic conditions, you have what's happening in the world. Right? There are some elections that have been seriously affected by crises that happened abroad. And then you have the campaigns that they run, and that's more in the realm of contingency. You know, what do they do to try to make something out of the situation that they find themselves in? And I agree. I think it's going to be close. At this point, at least. I mean, something could radically change, but at this point, I would anticipate that it'll be closer than 2008. I mean, I think, I may be wrong, but I can't think of a state right now that Obama lost in 2008 that he's going to be in a good position to win in 2012. But there are a number of states like Indiana, North Carolina, states that Obama won very narrowly in 2008 that are going to be very much in play. I think Ohio and Florida are going to be very much in play, and maybe Pennsylvania. So, you know, the economy will be a big part of that. But I think that political scientists have sometimes become too reductionist on this, and they take the economy and think that that's the only thing you need to know. And it may be one of the most important things, or even the most important thing, but it's certainly not the only thing.
Let's go to some questions from the audience. We only have about 15 minutes left, so we have several questions from the audience, one of which we had several questions about the 2012 election and what role healthcare would play. So we've sort of addressed that. Here's a broader one. What, if anything, can be done to reverse the trend towards increased partisanship in D.C.? I'm going to amend that question a little bit and say in D.C. and is the problem increased partisanship in D.C. or in the country at large? Is the problem the politicians or the problem the voters, or is increased partisanship a problem? Paul, you want to?
Yeah, I wish we had talked about this more, because I think it is a huge issue. I think that it is very, very difficult to govern the country when you combine parliamentary politics. Basically, if it helps our party, it's good. If it helps the other party, it's bad. You know, I feel like we've moved a long way towards that kind of world. And there are many thriving democracies that have a system like that. It actually has quite a few virtues to it. It provides a kind of clarity and accountability. But you combine that with a set of rules that make it easy for the minority to throw a spoke in the wheels and gum everything up. Then it becomes very difficult. You know, that's part of why voters get so mad. You know, if you had a system where, Okay, one side's the majority, they're going to run the government, then we're going to have an election, and we can kick them out if we don't like it, right? Okay. So I think the kind of polarization combined with obstruction that we now have, the way that the filibuster has really taken over American politics in the last dozen years or so, is a big problem for governance. I think it is, again, there's a big debate in political science about how much this is about voters and how much it is about elites, about the most organized elements in politics. I think the evidence suggests pretty clearly that voters have not polarized nearly as much as elites have.
I disagree that we're quite as polarized or hopeless as some analysts have it. You know, if Barack Obama had come into office, and let's just be hypothetical here, let's say he'd called together a commission of Democrats, and they would have included Alice Rivlin, who was Bill Clinton's budget director, Brookings Institution. John Breaux, the former senator from Louisiana, who was with Bob Kerrey on the Medicare Commission under Bill Clinton and proposed basically the Ryan plan for capitation on Medicare and vouchers. Ron Wyden from Oregon, who's co-sponsoring a bill with Paul Ryan on Medicare. A whole bunch of Democrats. And said, you know, we're going to have a compromise, and we really are going to take the best ideas from the Democrats and the best ideas from the Republicans, and we're going to see if we can have maybe not a comprehensive bill as big as I want, but something that moves the ball forward. It's going to be pre-existing conditions. It's going to be health care pools. It's going to be catastrophic health insurance for all. Not a complete comprehensive plan, but catastrophic health insurance. And maybe it'll have a mandate, but you can opt out of it for 5 years as long as you don't accept any of the government subsidies or benefits to get health insurance. A whole range of things, and adding medical savings accounts in. Now, I've talked to Ron Wyden, and I've talked to Alice Rivlin, and I've talked to John Breaux, and these are all Democrats, and they think it would have been possible. So I think the polarization depends on what your starting point is and what you want to accomplish. Is it going to be a real compromise? Will you really do blend the two parties' ideas? Or is it going to be one in which you, as Obama originally decided he was going to do with health care, if I get 10 to 15% of Republicans over, then we call that bipartisanship. Well, look, Medicare passed with 80% support under Lyndon Johnson. Civil Rights Act passed with 80% support. Almost all of the major social legislation we've had in this country post-World War II has passed with overwhelming majorities. Now, I don't think we've changed that much that you can't do that again, but the compromise has to be much more blended and much more genuine, and not just one party bringing a few people over on the basis of, you know, Cornhusker kickbacks or something.
But in those, Paul, do you want to? But in those cases of Medicare, for instance, weren't the parties vastly different and vastly less ideologically divergent at that time? There were still lots of conservative Southern Democrats, Northeastern liberal Republicans.
That's why I'm saying, rather than bemoan the partisanship, you have to redefine the compromise. Okay, if the parties are far apart, that means you have to have a genuine compromise that really does bring ideas from both sides of the aisle. And look, the Breaux-Kerrey Bill Thomas Medicare Commission in 1998, which is not light years away, did that. It didn't happen because of Monica Lewinsky and all of that. You know, Alice Rivlin and Paul Ryan's ideas, they still agree on a lot. Ron Wyden and Paul Ryan. You can do it, but I think the compromise has to be giving up more of what you really want and accepting more of what the other side wants. I still think compromise is possible, but it has to be much more of a true blend.
I think it is very, very difficult to compromise when the parties are as far apart as they are, unless the compromise is about doing very little. You know, if you're actually trying to deal with the problems, I think it's much more difficult. And just can I finish? Just to give an example, there have been two reports come out, one recently in the Washington Post and one that's coming out in the New York Times Magazine, looking at the attempts to broker some kind of a deficit reduction deal in 2011. And I think even though the reporters make an effort to try to say, well, you know, both sides are to blame here, I think if you read those articles carefully, what is very clear is that the Republicans in the House, Boehner may be accepted, but he could not bring the rest of his caucus with him. He couldn't even bring the leadership with him. They were not willing to agree to any kind of deal, which Obama desperately wanted, too desperately in my view, but they were not willing to agree to any deal that actually included a genuine increase in revenues, right? if we were willing to pretend magic fairy dust land where you cut taxes and it increases revenues, they were up for that. But they weren't actually up for doing anything that was going to actually involve imposing new taxes on people. So their approach to compromise, and again, the evidence in these articles is very clear that the administration really wanted to compromise and was willing to accede to big budget cuts, right? Their idea of a compromise was, you give us everything we want, and we give you nothing that you want.
Let me go to another question here from the audience. Here is a question that is so perfect for helping Anne sell books that I think her husband must have written it. I don't know. Can you make any forecast about how successful women will be in this year's election season? And again, I'm going to do what I normally do and say, and beyond that, what about women in presidential politics going forward?
Well, I can make a prediction about how women will do in presidential politics this year, which is to say, not going to win. I think after
in future.
But I mean, I would have, if you'd asked me at the end of the last election, well, is it going to at least inspire more women to run for office, even if it's going to be hard for them to win? I would have thought, yes, more people will be inspired. I mean, that was Hillary Clinton's great hope, and what Sarah Palin said when she picked up the nomination. And in fact, the opposite is true. We did a big story 2 weeks ago. There are fewer women running for office because they read Game Change. They looked at the election in 2008, they looked at what happened to Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin, and they said, I want no part of that. And already, I mean, everybody knows the statistics. Women are 17% of Congress, which is lower than, ranks us somewhere, I think, around 87th in the world. But if women run, they tend to win at the same rates as men do. It's not that they lose elections or can't even fundraise, it's that women just don't run as often. They're about 1/3 as likely to be recruited for office. So that doesn't bode well. There are some states that do really well with women. Obviously, California has a history of women in the Senate, that, in particular, that has been very strong. There are other states in South Carolina currently. I think there are no women in the state Senate whatsoever. So it really, there is a governor currently for now. So I think it does vary from state to state. Democrats have many more women in elected office than Republicans do, although after this year, I think all the women who are governors will be Republican women. So as to the prospects for the future, I don't think they have increased by leaps and bounds since 4 years ago, or even 20 years ago was the famous year of the woman. And what you've seen since then is basically a plateau. But for the rest, you're just going to have to buy my book. I'm sorry. I don't have time.
If I could say something, just one thing I'd add quickly about that is that I do think in the long term, it's good for the prospects of women that there are more women becoming governors, because governors actually do much better in presidential races than members of Congress. And so to the extent that more women become governors, I think in the long run that will increase chances of a woman president.
But it's worth pointing out right now there are 6 governors, and 2 of them are leaving office, so there will be 4. Right. Which is not very many.
A final question, we'll go back to the president. What's the worst thing that Obama has done? What's the best? What's the most important? So answer any of those that you wish, but what's the single greatest legacy or fact or the most important thing to come out of the first Obama term? Andrew, do you want to start on that?
Well, I guess from my perspective, the best thing was the fact that he has actually taken a more aggressive approach toward terrorism than I think a lot of people expected he would. I think the fact that he found and dispatched Osama bin Laden is probably the high point of his presidency at this point. As to the worst, it's hard to know without historical perspective. It's hard to look at that, and that goes for the best, for that matter. I guess my instinct at this point would say probably the healthcare bill, but that's obviously a perspective that's not always shared. So,
Paul, what's the most important legacy of the first term?
So I think, and it actually comes back to something that Andrew was saying earlier about imagining what might have happened. I think the stimulus package, I think given where we are certainly everything that I have read about assessments of insiders of the state of the economy at the time, I think we really dodged a bullet there. I think it was like everything produced in Washington, very imperfect. And I think, I was thinking about the possible answer to the biggest mistake. There's lots of room for criticism of some of the activities of some of his economic advisors. He was told, as John was saying earlier, he was told, pass that stimulus package. It's not as big as it should be, but if you pass it, the unemployment rate will be under 8% by the 2010 elections. That's what he was told by his advisors. Turned out they were wrong, right? People make mistakes. It's a complicated world. We can't predict the future out there. But, I think there is room for, some Monday morning quarterbacking about the economic advice that he got early on. But that being said, I think we came very close in 2008 and early 2009 to total meltdown. And we know what happened in the 30s and early 40s as a result of the last total meltdown. And I think most economists, not all, but most economists believe that the stimulus package really helped, including lots of Republican economists who, Mark Zandi, McCain's chief economic advisor, thinks that the stimulus helped. Marty Feldstein, Reagan's Council of Economic Advisor, thinks it helped. The list is long, right? Didn't do enough. We're still really struggling, but it was a huge deal.
John? Surprisingly, I'll say judges. And the reason is, I think that Obama was in the Senate when the Supreme Court nominations of John Roberts and Sam Alito were pretty bitter. Sam Alito only got 56 votes for confirmation. By the way, in this completely polarized town, both Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan received overwhelming votes. I think over half of Republicans in both cases voted to confirm them. Both of those were well-qualified justices. I tend to disagree with their jurisprudence, but they were very well qualified. On the appeals court and district court level, with some exceptions, I think they've been very well qualified and pretty judicious. The sad thing is, and goes to the issue of performance, the sad thing is he has even with a Democratic Senate for 4 years, I'm taking it back, for the entire time he's been president, even with a Democratic Senate, he has the lowest confirmation rate of any president since Eisenhower. I mean, it's really been astonishing how few judges he's gotten confirmed. And that's simply because they've been doing other stuff. But
not the full explanation for why they haven't.
Well, remember, he had a Democratic Senate.
You can block people from coming out for confirmation votes.
It's not been primarily that. Most people will say they simply haven't spent the time and effort to get these people confirmed. Bill Clinton had a Republican Senate and got an awful lot more judges confirmed. And he had a Republican Senate for 6 out of 8 years. So it can be done. Bottom line, I think the judges that he has confirmed have been better than most Republicans thought they would be. They've been very well qualified. And in the case of Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, pretty much the top of their profession.
We'll let you and Paul argue about confirmation process later. But anyway, and you covered the White House for a lot of this period. What's the most important thing that's happened in the Obama administration?
Well, I think I would say, I think I'd start by saying we've been talking for an hour and a half, and we have not mentioned the fact that he's the first African-American president. And I think the fact that he's been able to talk about issues and that we're talking about the substance of what he did and that that's not part of the re-election. That was a huge part of the election in the first place. I think that's probably something that when history looks back 50, 100 years from now will be important. I think at a more substantive level on terrorism, the fact that, yes, he did obviously kill Osama bin Laden, but has also dramatically expanded the drone program, I think we'll look back, again, some decades from now, and either that will have been a great decision or a terrible one, depending on what happens and how it works out for humanity.
And on that excellent historical point that it's the first African-American president, we didn't talk about that, but anyway, on an excellent historical point, we're done. We hope that you all come back next year. We'll, depending on, you can either hope or fear we have a new president to talk about, or maybe 4 more years. In the meantime, my thanks to the panel, Andrew Busch, Paul Pierson, John Fund, and Kornblut. Thank you. Good night. Great. That was fun. Great.